Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 10 sequels that are better than the originals. In this video, I count down my top 10 favorite movie sequels that I believe were better than the movie that spawned it. This video was suggested by one of my commenters, Kevin Dupai. And although I typically don't take viewer requests for videos, as my plate is already too full, this idea intrigued me, so I thought it was worth a shot. So in this countdown, I take into account how much better the sequel is than the movie that came before it. So this countdown will look very different than the countdown of best movie sequels, as I do have to take into consideration how much better than the original it was, as there are plenty of great sequels, but they are not necessarily better than the original, and if they are, maybe they're not by much. So in this countdown, movies aren't just ranked on how good they are, but how much better than the original they are. So some movies may end up ranked higher than other movies I like better, depending on how much better they are than the original. And of course, the whole list is just my opinion, and it may not always match up with popular opinion, but I stick to my guns regardless. So before I get into what is on my list, let me talk about what isn't on my list, as there are several movies many would expect to make this list, or a list like this, as it's popular opinion that these sequels are better than the original, but I do not necessarily agree. So first film you may expect to see on this list that isn't is Terminator 2 Judgment Day, as I actually preferred the first Terminator movie to this one, as I think the emotional story of Kyle Reese protecting Sarah Connor had more emotional impact, as well as I felt Terminator 2 borrowed a bit too heavily from the first movie. Another sequel you will not find on this list is The Dark Knight, as I have been very vocal about how I don't really care that much for this movie, as most do, and I actually preferred Batman Begins to this film, but that's just me. And last movie I'll mention that isn't on this list is The Godfather Part 2, as I have actually never seen that movie, nor have I seen Part 1 or any Godfather movie, because mafia movies aren't really my thing, so it doesn't really look appealing to me. So now, let me get into what is on my list of top 10 movie sequels that are better than the original, starting with my number 10, Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. Now this film barely makes the list, because technically it's not better than the original, as I liked the first Mission Impossible movie better than this film. However, after the first Mission Impossible film, they had three terrible to mediocre films, and Rogue Nation was the first sequel to actually recapture the magic of the first film. Mission Impossible 2 was a giant piece of dog shit. Mission Impossible 3 was average and forgettable, and Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol was just a boring, tired rehash that offers absolutely nothing new. However, Rogue Nation was an action-packed thrill ride with an exciting plot that managed to keep you engaged, as well as fully developed concrete characters, and this film was wise enough to once again focus on the team effort rather than all about Tom Cruise. On top of that, they present the best Bond girl ever seen in any film, with Rebecca Ferguson, who absolutely stole the show. So because this film was way better than the three sequels that preceded it, I decided to include it on my list at number 10. So coming in at number 9 is The Naked Gun 2.5. Now, the first Naked Gun movie was a magnificent movie, which is why this film only ranks at number 9. However, I personally think 2.5 was even better and went the extra mile, as it was just jam-packed with joke after funny joke, even more so than the first film. And as great as the finale at the baseball stadium was in the first film, I felt before that it wasn't quite as consistently funny when dragging a few places, whereas 2.5 just would not let up, with great joke after great joke, and it had much more higher stakes in the plot, which allowed for more humor to come out, which is why The Naked Gun 2.5 comes in at number 9 on my list. Next, on to my number 8, which is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Now, I must confess I am not a huge Harry Potter fan. I never read the books, and I never will. When I first saw the trailer for the first Harry Potter movie, I thought it looked horrible, and I thought that this movie would bomb. Of course, eventually I was proven incredibly wrong when it came out, and it was an international smash hit. But still, for the longest time, I refused to watch these movies as I thought they looked like childish nonsense. But eventually I did watch them, and when I watched the first two movies, although I thought they weren't that bad, I still was pretty much unimpressed, and I still didn't understand why these Harry Potter films were so popular. That was until I saw the third film, The Prisoner of Azkaban. This was the film that finally took the Harry Potter franchise, when I finally took the Harry Potter franchise seriously, as this film was really impressive. Rather than being childish nonsense, it had a very creepy and effectively thrilling story about an escaped convict bent on killing Harry Potter. But when it ended on a very intriguing time travel storyline, that it just really blew me away, because I love time travel, particularly when it's done very well, and I thought it was done very well here. And this remains to this day my favorite Harry Potter film, and I see it has a huge improvement on the two previous films, which is why it comes in at number 8. Next, we'll get into my number 7, which I most likely will make a lot of people very furious, and I'll get a ton of disagreement on, but so be it. And my number 7 is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. This is something I don't mention very often, as I know is very widely unpopular, but I don't like Raiders of the Lost Ark. I never liked it as a kid. I thought it was boring and slow, and then when I rewatched it as an adult, I still found it boring and also bland and uninteresting. I didn't totally hate it, but I don't much care for it either, and never understood why it was so well liked. The second film, The Temple of Doom, was even worse. What a flaming piece of garbage. I can honestly say it is one of the worst films that I've ever seen, and I would equate it to the quality of something like Superman 3. And as much as people love to bitch about the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, I honestly thought I much preferred that film to the Temple of Doom, which is why I was surprised on how much I loved The Last Crusade, which honestly is the only Indiana Jones movie I actually like. Unlike the previous two, I felt the characters were really well developed. I actually felt invested in them, and the inclusion of Sean Connery as Indiana's father was a stroke of brilliance, as it not only adds a nice touch of comic relief, it actually helps flesh out the protagonist in this film and make him feel real. And the story, rather than dragging, was incredibly engaging and actually felt like an exciting adventure, all leading up to this final sequence where Maester Pycelle drinks out of the wrong cup and crumbles into a skull and dies, which is one of the most memorable classic scenes that I can think of. So that's why it comes in at number 7. Next, we'll move on to my number 6 on my list, which is Star Trek Beyond. Now, to be clear, when I say it's better than the original, I'm not considering any of the original series or Next Generation films, as I consider these reboot series its own thing. And to be honest, I almost went with Into Darkness, as I thought it was a huge improvement on the poorly written CGI shit show fest that was Star Trek 2009. However, Into Darkness, although far superior to that 2009 piece of shit, still had its flaws and still didn't really feel like Star Trek. Star Trek Beyond, however, was the first of these reboot films I actually think deserved to have the name Star Trek, as it was the first that actually felt like a Star Trek film. The characters actually felt like their namesake counterparts, and the story finally had that classic feel and themes inherent to Star Trek. On top of that, it actually had a plot that was well constructed and made sense. Sure, like 2009, the villain was bland and uninteresting, but in every other way imaginable, it was a huge improvement on Star Trek 2009, which is why it comes in at number 6 on my list. Coming in at number 5 is Logan. Now, some say that this might not really be a sequel as it stands on its own, but it is the third standalone Wolverine movie, so I am counting it as a sequel. But to be clear, I am not including any of the other X-Men films, as this isn't an X-Men film, it's a Wolverine film. So compared to X-Men Origins Wolverine and The Wolverine, this movie absolutely blows both of these films out of the water. X-Men Origins Wolverine was just a messy piece of garbage that got so much wrong. The Wolverine was a bit better, but still only an average movie and somewhat forgettable. But Logan was one of the best comic book movies I've ever seen. It had a lot of heart and almost an art house type feel to it, as Logan was a tired old man taking care of Charles Xavier, who was suffering from Alzheimer's, and while at the same time trying to take care of an orphaned girl. And the relation he had with them made for great drama. On top of that, it was a much more exciting, coherent action superhero film, which is probably the most effective, depressing superhero movie that I've seen. And thus, it was far superior to the two Wolverine movies that came before it, which is why it comes in at number 5 on my list. Coming in at number 4 is another superhero movie, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. I really did not like the first Captain America movie. In fact, I thought it was a bland, unoriginal piece of garbage that embodied everything that I don't like about comic book movies. So when another Captain America movie came out, I had no interest in seeing it until I heard everyone ranting and raving about how great it was. So I thought, well, I should at least give it a shot. And when I did, I was very surprised to find that this film did indeed live up to all the hype, as it was one of the most successful espionage suspense films I've ever seen. Not only did it present really strong characters, but also an extremely engaging story that I feel blows most spy films out of the water. I personally consider this one of the best comic book movies ever made, which is a huge difference from the original, which is just another below average comic book drivel. The difference is simply staggering, which is why it comes in at number 4 on my list. So next we'll get to number 3, which is The Empire Strikes Back. So many might be surprised to see this movie on my list after my announcement that how much better the sequel is than the original would be taken into consideration. But the truth is, I'm not a huge fan of the first Star Wars movies, now referred to as Episode 4: A New Hope. I was never really into that as a kid, as I remember when I was 8, a friend of mine trying to get me to watch it, and I wasn't really into it. The Empire Strikes Back, on the other hand, I loved and would watch repeatedly throughout my teenage years. Watching these films as an adult, though, I find A New Hope to be very simplistic, and parts of it come off as too much like a cheesy, simplistic 40s serial, with some cheesy cartoonish scenes such as the final award-giving scene. Whereas The Empire Strikes Back was a complex, powerful thrill ride that explored the complexity of these characters, that featured one of the most staggering twists in film history. Many have rightfully noted that Darth Vader is one of the best villains of all time, and it wasn't because of the first film where he was simply a number 2 typical bad guy, but it was because, nor was it because of Return of the Jedi, which is more about the redemption of Anakin Skywalker, but it was because of this film where he was truly off the leash and just going around strangling people with his force powers and just being a total badass, and had lines like "Apology accepted, Captain Nita." And plus we get the introduction of Yoda, who's one of the most memorable characters in film history, who added a perfect blend of comic relief and thoughtfulness to the film. So the whole film was a perfect adventure story and the real reason why I love Star Wars. So now, getting to my number 2, which is Aliens. So, this is apparently like a big epic debate that will go on forever. Which film is better, Alien or Aliens? But to me, this isn't even a question. Aliens is by far the superior movie in every way. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't hate Ridley Scott's Alien. It was an effective, scary horror film that I'm sure in its day used to be original, and probably my favorite Ridley Scott film, as I'm not a huge fan of that director. However, I was never that impressed with it, and it never came close to being considered one of my all-time favorite films, because at its core, it's just another monster movie about a monster going around killing people until the last survivor manages to kill it. Aliens, on the other hand, is one of the most masterfully done films of all time, and it's uniquely brilliant as a sequel because you have this beloved horror movie Alien instead of simply doing a boring rehash of the exact same thing, which is what so many other horror movie franchise sequels did, especially in the 80s, and unfortunately what Alien 3 did. Aliens actually took it in a totally different direction by adding an element of action to it while keeping the element of horror and completely upping the ante by making it not just about one alien terrorizing a spaceship, but a whole cluster of aliens terrorizing that took over a colony that our protagonists have to escape from. But most importantly, it adds an element of heart by giving us to really care about these characters who so easily could come off as generic space marines but don't, and most importantly getting us inside the mind of Ripley by giving her a daughter figure to protect. In my opinion, Alien is an interesting 70s horror film, and Aliens is a timeless sci-fi action suspense horror masterpiece, and the real reason why people remember this franchise as much as they do, making this the second favorite sequel that is better than the originals. And finally, let me get to my number one movie sequel that's better than the original, and that is Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Now, arguably, this is less of a movie sequel and more of their second attempt at adapting this classic TV show to the big screen, and where the first film failed, the second film succeeded with flying colors. However, I had to put this at number one, as the difference in quality between the first film and its sequel is the biggest disparity between any film and its sequel in film history. I know some people now attempt to defend Star Trek the Motion Picture. Some notable people like Carl Urban even go as far to say that it's their favorite Star Trek film, but I feel a deep unbiased analysis of this film will reveal it to be a total mess. In my opinion, a film that was rushed too quickly by the studios, as the producing team didn't really know what they were doing, as the script was being written while they were filming. The tone is all over the place, as the studios wanted another Star Wars film, Gene Roddenberry wanted to make a 2-hour-long Star Trek episode, and the director wanted to make the sequel to 2001. So the result is a jumbled mess with no real tone and 2.5-hour-long movie of a story that could have been told better in 35 minutes, as it just stretches on forever at an unforgivable slow pace. Star Trek II, however, is rightfully recognized by many, including myself, as the best Star Trek movie of all time, as it's one of the most classic examples of an epic game of cat and mouse set in space, and at the same time tells a very touching personal story of James Kirk coming to terms with his aging and discovering that he has a son. And that's not even getting into the ending, which is one of the most touching, tear-inducing endings of any film of all time. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan is one of the best classic films of all time, whereas Star Trek the Motion Picture was just a giant, boring disaster, which is what makes Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan my number one favorite movie sequel that was better than the original. So that's it for my top 10 sequels that are better than the originals. Be sure to check out my channel for many more movie review videos, as well as many videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, The Leftovers, Better Call Saul, Sense8, The 100, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.